in the
Yeah.
morning, and you told me you're at a conference.
Yes.
So
Yes.
life has turned back to normal in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Ah, that's great. That must be so great to be in that stadium right now, to be able to do everything you like. So how are things going in New Zealand? Because of course you've experienced the lockdown as well.
Yeah, but we only had lockdown for a couple of months in March last year. So we had level 4 for a month, which meant you could only go out for walking around your neighbourhood kind of thing, and you had to have you could have people in your bubble. They were people living with you basically. And then we went to level 3 where we could expand our bubble.
Yeah,
So schools were in lockdown basically for 2 months, but that's all. That's it really.
but everything has turned back to normal. Is there? Do you notice anything about any crisis nowadays in New Zealand, or um, is it totally absent?
I guess the only thing is that we can't travel overseas. So, or we can, but if you when you come back, then you have to go into quarantine and you have to pay
Yeah.
because you've chosen to leave. So really, we can't leave,
Mm.
and people can't come here. Only Kiwis can come back home, or they get some kind of special dispensation to come here. But yeah, I mean, internally, everything is just the same. We get daily updates on how many people have come in from overseas with COVID.
Oh wow. Yeah, yeah. We live in a
But
daily
when they
update.
arrive, when they arrive at the airport, they get put onto a bus and taken to a managed isolation
Yeah,
hotel,
I see.
and they have to stay there for 14 days, and they get tested, I think, about 3 times
Okay,
before they're
I
before they're
see.
allowed out.
Well, it's an honor to have you here on my podcast and interview series. Today we're going to talk about high expectations and about your book, becoming a high expectation teacher, because it's really relevant for the Netherlands. It's really relevant for today's world, I think, especially now when so many students are isolated. How do we keep them motivated, and how do we make sure we set realistic goals and have realistic expectations? So I'm really keen to talk about that. So the purpose of my interview, as I wrote to you, is to inform my connections and followers on LinkedIn and on my website, and hopefully to inspire them to become high expectation teachers. You've visited the Netherlands a couple of times. Actually, when I did my research about you, when I was looking for interviews, it's mainly Dutch. Dutch conferences, Dutch articles in Didactief, for example, a Dutch magazine. So you have a connection with the Netherlands. Could you elaborate a bit about your relationship with the Netherlands and your view about Dutch education?
Well, I guess there are a couple of researchers in the Netherlands who do some really good work around teacher expectations. So one of those is Anneke Timmermans, and another one is Eddie Dennison.
Yeah.
So, and there are others actually in the Netherlands too, but those two in particular I've worked quite closely with. So I, I mean, I've been to the Netherlands for conferences, but Eddie invited me over at the end of 2019, and I did 5 different talks over there, and then he also launched a book where they had um, different chapters by different
Mm-hmm.
about different people's work basically, and one of them was about my work. So then I was asked to say something at the book launch, and I was in Morocco. That was the beginning of last
Oh,
year.
all right.
How things have changed. So I had to
Yeah,
do this book launch from my hotel
yeah,
in Morocco, which was interesting.
yeah. Yeah, but you have physically visited Leiden, I believe, a couple
Yeah,
of conferences.
yeah.
So what do you think of the Netherlands as a country, and the city of Leiden in particular?
I mean, I like the Netherlands. I like the Dutch people as well. They're very friendly. They're very helpful. I had a really nice time when I was there. And I also went the year before, I went to a conference that was being held in Groningen, is it Groningen?
Yeah, yeah,
Something like that.
it,
And that's where Annika is.
yeah,
And so I spent about a week there too.
yeah,
Yeah, but
great.
it's pretty, the Netherlands.
So if you have to, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Dutch education system? Let's say three definitions, three words.
Well, I mean, I guess the main one is the tracking thing because it's something that I'm very much opposed to. I guess we have it in New Zealand as well, but in some ways less extreme, I guess, because in the Netherlands, kids end up going to specific schools, which means basically their life chances are determined when they're
Yeah,
only 11.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, of course, I'm going to address the topic in a bit because it really disturbs me as well. Because we track students as soon as they become 12 years old, as soon as they are 11 or 12 years old, and um, uh, people will say that children have all the opportunities to escape a trap. If you have an average of an 8.5 or a 7.5, you're allowed to go to a higher track, but of course, we know when materials are offered at a certain level and you're surrounded by certain peers, it's bloody difficult to escape a track. So I will get there because it's a personal frustration, the tracking. But first of all, I read in your bio or I saw in an interview that you were a teacher, a primary school teacher yourself for over 20 years, for over 2 decades. And
Yeah.
I'm always interested in personal stories, especially when it comes to teaching. So when you look back at your 20 years as a teacher, well, one of my questions was, do you remember your first day as a teacher?
Oh yes. I think you always remember your first day. I had always wanted to be a teacher right from when I was tiny, before I even went to school myself. So, I remember not being able to sleep the night before because I was so excited. And then the school that I was at in my first year teaching, in those days, there was a Department of Education and they just used to assign you to
Oh,
schools.
really?
And the particular school that I was at deliberately put first year teachers in a really tiny classroom so that you could only have 15 students. So, I mean, it was a lovely experience, really. But yeah, I I certainly remember. I can remember for years being really restless and excited the night before school started.
And what grades were you teaching?
I started off teaching year 7, 8, which are 11, 12 year olds. And then I was assigned again by the Department of Education to a year 1 class. So I went from year 7, 8 down to year 1, which
Wow,
was a real shock.
it's a big
But
transition.
my own children were small then, and also I had an associate principal who was absolutely outstanding, and she helped me because I hadn't really had any training either for teaching the little ones. But I loved it. I mean, I loved all my teaching. But then I went to another school after that, and I was again in year 1. But I gradually sort of went up the the age groups, if you like, and then most of my career I ended up with year 5 and 6 and 9 and 10 year olds.
So you had children at the same age, so you could relate to the young child. That's
Yeah,
of course
yeah,
a great benefit. I think that's the best school you can have, having children yourself. At least
yeah.
that's my experience. So, what were the biggest challenges during those 2 decades?
I think for me, one of them was putting my hand on my heart at the end of an academic year and being able to honestly say that every single child in my class had made large gains over that year. I think that's always because my primary aim, if you like, when I was teaching was always to try and make a difference for kids. So I for myself needed to be able to say, yes, I've made a difference for every single kid.
And how would you know? I mean, I in the United States you have the AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress, and standardized testing. And how would you assess that in New Zealand?
Um, we've never been big on standardized tests, but when I first began teaching, there was a test that you could give kids that they used to give them every March. But of course, March is the beginning, near the beginning of our academic year. But we didn't, as just an ordinary classroom teacher, I never saw what my kids had got the next year. So I guess it was just watching them go up levels, setting goals with them, seeing them making progress through the year more than anything else. But then when I was a DP, a deputy principal, then I could see the actual results of the kids across classes. And so you would notice classes where kids had made huge gains over a year
Hmm.
versus classes where they hadn't. And if you went into those classes, within a few seconds, it was very obvious why kids were making progress in some classes but not others. Just
So
the atmosphere of the class.
the New Zealand education system is really unfamiliar to me. I've spoken to one of your professor colleagues, James R. Flynn, who passed away actually a couple of months ago, I believe.
Oh, okay.
2 months ago. So I'm not really familiar with the New Zealand system. If you compare it to, for example, the Netherlands or maybe the United States, well, we have a punitive system with a lot of standardized testing, punitive accountability, a typical United States word, punitive accountability. Um, so what does the New Zealand system look like compared to our system, for example?
Just before I answer that, you do know that John Hattie is a New Zealander as well.
Yeah, but when I interviewed him, he was in Australia.
Yeah, he is there now,
Ah,
but
he's
he is a Kiwi originally.
yeah.
Anyway, um, sorry, now I've kind of lost track of the question.
No,
In New Zealand, we probably about 5 6 years ago, 5 years ago maybe, the government introduced a system where teachers had to give kids one standardized test a year, but that's all. And you choose which standardized test you use as well. So when John Hattie was back in New Zealand, he developed a standardized test which is called EASTL, and that's the one that I like the best. And teachers who use it like it because New Zealand education is very much formative. It's much more formative than summative. And EASTL does give you means, so it does tell you where each kid is in relation to the mean, but it's also very summative. So it gives you the kinds of objectives in the curriculum where kids are doing really well, but also what they need to work on next. So it has very clear guidelines for teachers about what they need to teach
and
next.
what consequences do these tests have for the children? I mean, in the Netherlands, if you fail or flunk a certain test, you're not allowed entrance into a university. You need to finish a certain track. So how does it work in New Zealand?
Well, we don't have any form of retention that was out. That was It was actually put into law. I think in the 80s. So you're not allowed to retain children
All
at
right.
all in New
Yeah.
Zealand. They're always with their own age group. So there are no real consequences for kids in terms of standardized testing, certainly when they're younger. When they get to the end of secondary school, there are national level kinds of exams that they can opt into, but again, they're standards based. But you can get a pass, a merit, or an
Hmm.
excellence in each for each strand, and then that determines whether you can get into university or not, or it also determines particular careers. So if you wanted to go into medicine, for example, you're going to have excellences in some subjects. But then as well in New Zealand, once you turn 21, you have a right to go to university any rate.
Yeah.
So so anybody
Yeah.
then can go if they want to.
Yeah.
There's no restriction then. And so, for example, if you wanted to do medicine again, then obviously if you've got no academic kind of background that would let you go into that, you could, for example, go and do some courses in science or something like that at the university and then use that as a track through.
So is
It's much more difficult, of course,
yeah,
than getting high grades when you're at school, but there are options available for people.
and is education for free in New Zealand?
Yes, or at university you have to pay fees, but the government subsidise it hugely.
Yeah.
So students pay about a third of the actual cost. The rest is
Yeah.
paid for by the government.
Yeah, because Finland has a similar system. I interviewed Pasi Samok a couple of years ago, and the Director General of the Finnish Ministry of Education told me that because education is for free, everybody can give it a try, and sometimes it's a bit costly. I mean, not everybody is fit for a university, so that's a problem they have in Finland because it's free. Everybody is trying, and it doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah,
So
well, in New Zealand, again until the 80s, it university was free as well. But then they introduced, but you can get student loans, and then you don't actually have to physically pay for anything, but you've then got to pay the loan back once you get a job.
of
So
course, yeah. So
that's not so good.
my last question before we move on to your book and the work of Robert Rosenthal. Um, when you started 20 years ago, of course, in primary education, which must have been longer than 20 years, I realize, but um, it was a totally different world. What was the main difference 20 at the start of your career compared to 20 years later?
I think in New Zealand, probably the major thing that's changed is that New Zealand was founded as a bicultural nation. But when I was first teaching, there was no real inclusion of Māori language or culture. Whereas now it's compulsory. It's compulsory for every teacher to be able to use at least some level of te reo, the language,
Oh,
and you have to include Māori culture in all the curriculum areas as well. So there's much more recognition of our bicultural heritage and our obligations to the Treaty of Waitangi as well. So I think that's been a big shift because it creates a cultural shift within school as well
yeah,
when you acknowledge other cultures.
and
It's
that's
not it's not European dominated like it used
uh,
to the degree that it used to be.
and that does generate better results than the approach the Australians have with the Aboriginals, the Canadians have with the natives, and the Americans have with their American Indians.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. So for example, the percentages of Maori who go to university have increased hugely. More than 100% they've increased over the last, decade or so because they have more access and there's more recognition and support that for the idea that our education system's always been very I always say Pākehā because that's New Zealand European. It's always been very Pākehā dominated and oriented,
Mm-hmm.
and now there is much more recognition. It seems incredible as well, but from this year, it's actually compulsory for students to learn Māori history in school as well. So you could go right through secondary school before this year and not actually do anything around New Zealand history or around Māori history. It was if you did learn it, it was very whitewashed British version,
Yeah.
whereas
Yeah.
now they have to teach the true version of our history.
You're really an example for the rest of the world, not only in education but politics as well. I mean, the world is watching you when it comes to COVID-19. It's amazing. So before you wrote your book, there was this one,
Uh huh.
Pygmalion in the Classroom, a really seminal book of our common hero, Robert Rosenthal. You spent quite some pages explaining what he did. So, when did you first encounter his work?
Well, I guess when I first went into my doctorate, his is the seminal study in the field.
Mhm.
So you naturally come across it right at the very beginning.
And when did you first meet him? Because you've become friends in the end, and you've done some research together. So, how did you grow into working together?
Um, Originally, I emailed him because I guess I had a connection with Rona Weinstein first, and I used to go and visit Rona fairly regularly, and so I emailed Bob because I was going to visit Rona and asked about coming to visit him, and he's lovely, Bob
Yes,
Rosenthal.
yes.
He's a really lovely man, and yeah, so I mean, I went there and I visited him, and I did that a couple of times, and then I had part of a sabbatical there. I spent 3 months with him, and we did some, that's when we wrote papers and we did stuff together.
Yeah, because what he established in the book, uh, there is an effect, some effect, because if we have high expectations for even in rats and other worms, there's a page on worms actually, and uh, it it has a really significant effect, but it's really unclear yet what those parameters, what those um, elements are, and that's where you pick up your work. I mean, you're really zooming in on what's happening in classrooms that causes a higher achievements. So, would you like to tell us, my viewers and my readers, where do you pick up the work of Robert Rosenthal, and where do you continue, and how does it work?
Well, when I began looking at this area, which because expectations was my doctoral area, as I said earlier, I knew from having been a deputy principal that in some classes kids were making huge learning gains, whereas in other classes they virtually didn't move at all. And so I was interested in right from the beginning in the idea that there were some teachers who had high expectations for all their kids. And in those classes, the kids made huge learning gains, as opposed to other classes where expectations were low and you didn't get great gains. But when I started reading the literature in the area, all the literature then was around the idea that teachers had high expectations for some students
Hmm.
and low expectations for others. There was nothing around the idea that there were some teachers who had high expectations for everybody, regardless, and other teachers who had low. So that's kind of how my work extended the area, was the idea that yes, I mean I certainly agree that there can be teachers who will have higher expectations for some kids than for others, but nevertheless there are teachers, and I think that's the important element. There are teachers who have high expectations for all of their kids, and when they have high expectations, then they institute specific pedagogical practices that mean that their kids do
Yeah.
really well. It's not magic. It's not, it's not rocket science. They actually have firm beliefs about what you need to do if you're going to enable your kids to make big gains.
Yeah, well, of course, it's not rocket science. But what Rosendahl didn't do was observe classrooms 24/7 or 5 days a week. So it was really hard to put a finger on where the results came from. What were the essential elements? So how how did you implement? How did you start your research? How do you start from where he ended his research? What was your first?
So, so as I said, I mean, I had done lots of reading
Hmm.
around expectations and within the expectation area. And this question kept popping up in my head of, yes, but are there teachers who have high expectations for everybody? And so when I embarked on my doctorate, I did some of those things you're talking about. So, first of all, I measured teachers' expectations and I measured the kids' achievement at the beginning of the year. And then I looked at the learning gains over the year and found that there were differences. There were classes where kids made big gains, and there were classes where kids didn't make gains. But I also observed in all of the classrooms of the teachers who were in my sample, so not just the highs and the lows. I hadn't even identified that at that stage, but I observed in all those classes, and I also interviewed all the teachers. And then it wasn't until the end of the year, when I had the academic results, that I
Hmm.
could see that where the teachers had really high expectations for the kids, they also made huge learning gains. So then I could go back to the observational data and the interview data and start to pull it out and look at,
Hmm.
so what were the things that these teachers actually did that were different from what was happening in low expectation classes.
So
So
could
it was really about going from the individual teachers and individual students, to looking at teachers. So putting the focus on teachers rather than on students.
so you address many elements of teacher instruction and elements that are important, like gender, like socio-economic background, like personality. So what are the most significant um, uh, biases or the most significant elements in the classroom that influence um, outcomes in learning?
Well, I mean, I guess we can't deny that the strongest influence on teachers' expectations is prior achievement. So teachers will very carefully go through the kids'
Hmm.
previous achievement and work out exactly where they are, to the point where, when I first came into the university, I was involved in a study where the teachers already had their kids in ability groups
Yeah.
before they'd even met them.
Hmm.
So, that hugely influences teachers' expectations. But then other factors, things like ethnicity or immigrant status, gender, although the the research around gender, some studies show biases, teacher biases, some studies don't. But certainly ethnicity and immigrant status have an influence on teacher expectations. I don't think there's a lot of doubt about that.
Yeah. I know Eddie Denesse in the Netherlands has done a lot of research um, and names. He did a nice research on names and biases. So
Yeah,
Arabic names and Dutch names, and it's so obvious. It's so obvious that that has a major influence. And of course, you know that when students are tracked in the eighth grade in the Netherlands when they're 12 years old, and they have similar scores, and one person is called Daniel and the other is called Mohammed. Daniel is going to the higher track in general. So these
yeah,
are really
yeah,
it's there out in the open. So, but it's really a sensitive topic because all teachers will say they are non-biased. They're really neutral, but nobody's going
yeah.
to.
I mean, I did a similar study to the one that Eddie did in New Zealand, and found similar biases against Maori versus New Zealand European. And we also looked at the influence of their bias on the student outcomes as well, and found, again, yes. And so when kids were in classes where New Zealand European kids were favoured, in those classes, the kids made an extra year's academic progress in maths compared to Maori. I mean, it's a big influence as
Amazing.
well.
But how do
Yeah.
you examine a teacher's bias? Because no teacher will admit that he has a bias toward a certain ethnicity. That would be.
No, but the studies that Eddie, those two studies that Eddie and I did were both around implicit bias. So implicit bias is measured. It's measured in a computer program, and it's measured in microseconds. So
Yeah.
the idea is that you don't have time to think, oh, hang on, I'm not supposed to be
Yeah.
biased.
Yeah.
It picks up if
Yeah.
you hesitate.
Yeah.
So if you think, for example, success and Māori don't go together, you will hesitate. And that's what the program measures.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a different to me. I mean, there's a lot of implicit bias is kind of the flavor of the month, that, if you like, at the moment.
Yeah.
To me, it's a different way of measuring teachers' expectations. But I mean, we've measured expectations for many years, and teachers will still rank kids. They will still have kids they think are going to do better than others.
Yeah.
It's, and
Yeah.
that's so they do admit they might not. If you said to them, do you have low expectations for Maori, for example, they would say no. But
Yeah.
if you measure it where they're predicting where the kids will get to at the end of the year, and you look at it across the class, then you will start to see patterns
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
they're predicting that Pākehā students are going to make much more progress than Maori, for example.
Interesting. I mean, that would be standard literature. I mean, for teachers, for school leaders, how nice would it be if there was an instrument? I'm sure there is, that schools can use in order to establish whether they have implicit biases or other kinds of biases, and even you could even do it anonymously. I mean, so but are there tools for schools to establish whether they have a certain bias towards certain groups?
Um, the implicit bias tests that you can use, that there are ones that you can use that are online, but they tend to be American. So, for example, they don't really apply in New Zealand, and they wouldn't apply in the Netherlands. So in order to run a test like that, you have to have somebody who can create the test in the first place.
Yeah.
So Eddie's group, for example, created one in the Netherlands. We've created ones in New Zealand. So, I mean, the analysis of the data is quite complex as
Yeah.
well. So it's not wouldn't be that easy for schools without training
No, of
to
course.
be able
But
to.
you have
You
to
could administer it, but you wouldn't be able to understand the output.
you have to agree with me that if you want to give students more opportunities, uh, and give them more chances in life, these tests are really important, and you have to get rid of these biases, implicit or really out in the open. It's a huge key, a huge element towards a more equitable society, I believe.
Yeah,
So, so, so,
I
so,
totally
so
agree.
where do you
I mean,
start?
it's the same as when I first identified high expectation and low expectation teachers. My first kind of um, aha moment, if you like, with the high expectation teachers, my first thought was, my God, we should clone those people
Yeah,
because they just were making such a difference. But then the opposite thought, we should be getting rid of these low expectation teachers. We don't want them in our schools. They make no difference. And in fact, kids often had negative relative gains in their
yeah,
classes. We
yeah,
don't want those kinds of people in schools, you know, in charge of our
yeah,
children.
yeah. That's
But
a really
yeah,
ethical question. 2 years ago, I interviewed Professor Eric Hanushek, and he what he thinks is best to fire the bottom 5 or 10% of teachers, and that will result in a huge increase in I don't know the economic terms. Anyway, it will generate billions and billions of dollars if you just get rid of the bottom 5%. But of course, hugely unethical, and I mean the unions will never allow for such ideas to to put in practice.
No. And I mean, I don't know what it's like in the Netherlands, but in New Zealand, it's really, really difficult to get rid of
Yeah,
teachers as well. And those are the ones that stand out as being awful.
yeah,
Some of these low expectation teachers would fly under the radar. You
yeah.
know,
Well,
they,
that we have the same problem in the Netherlands. Once you're tenured, it's really almost impossible to get rid of a bad teacher. It's always difficult to talk about bad teachers because define a bad teacher, but you know what I mean. And I think that's really one of the shortcomings of our system, that we don't have the tools to, well, get rid. It sounds so negative, but you know what I mean. Uh,
yeah,
Once you get tenure, there's no motivation to improve yourself or to be the best version of yourself. Well, there is, for some there's this intrinsic motivation, but for some there isn't. And they're going to be a teacher until they're 67. So that's a really harmful practice. So that's one harmful practice, and the other one. Let's go back to the implicit bias, or the biases in the open. So how do you talk to schools in order to motivate them to um, talk about these subjects?
I haven't done any work like that yet in around implicit bias. That's kind of my next um, project, if you like. So I've just submitted a grant application with some American colleagues. If we get funded, we would do a New Zealand and United States study looking at biases across both countries and how they play out in the classroom. So what we want to do is identify teachers who come out as being highly biased versus not so
Hmm.
much, and then observe in their classrooms, because if their kids aren't doing as well, and we would predict that that is happening, then that has to be being portrayed in classes in some way. There must be things that they do or say or ways they act in classes that give kids those kinds of messages. And then, having done that, establishing some kind of intervention, a bit like I did with the Teacher Expectation Project, where we would then have teachers who want to decrease bias, who are interested in
Hmm.
the idea of eliminating bias, treating kids more equitably, becoming more culturally responsive, those kinds of ideas. But we have to get funding.
Uh, the fact that we are tracking kids into certain levels when they're 12, to me that is an implicit bias. That your mind is so narrow that we say to a kid, you are the lowest level, you're going to do a vocational track because, well, you're not so smart. We don't say it in those words, but that's a bias. Am I right?
Of course, and the kids know as well. So that's reinforced every single day they go to school. Every single day they know that they're in the bottom track. So, I mean, those are the kinds of kids that often drop out of school and they lose motivation. Well, of course, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
When that kind of message is being reinforced, and you know that your life is kind of already planned out for you,
Yeah.
and you didn't have a lot of choice in it either.
And it's a fact
So,
that when you look at vocational tracks in the Netherlands, the majority, at least, well, a lot of kids are from minority backgrounds and poor socio-economic backgrounds, and nobody questions it. It's just a fact. When you go to a vocational track, most of the kids are from poor socio-economic backgrounds, and it's normal because the parents are not able to support them. So that's why we do it. There's no harm in doing that. We're doing them a service.
right.
So
Yeah.
so um, I'm just wondering. We're stuck in this system in Lens, and I'm really trying to do it differently. And what I would like to do is establish for each different subject for a kid. Okay, Dutch. You are really excellent at Dutch, but you're not so great at math. So when you go to high school, you will continue your excellent track with Dutch, and with math you need extra help. So you are going to do the I don't know, the extra help track. And what we do now in the Netherlands is we focus on math. That's clearly not your strongest subject. So all your subjects are going to be lowest level. It's like that in the Netherlands. I,
Yeah.
I find it I find it really troubling that all teachers accept that as a reality.
So yeah, I mean, in New Zealand, it's English. Everything is it's based around English. So if you do really well in English, then you end up in the top stream, and if you don't, you end up in one of the lower streams. But what you're talking about is setting. That's like they have in the UK, where they basically stream or track for every single subject. But I mean, I
Yeah,
would be going further than that. I would be saying all kids should be in mixed ability classes.
yeah, yeah,
All kids should
yeah,
have the opportunity to improve. As soon as you put kids in, it doesn't matter what the track or what you call it, as soon as you put them in ability groups, you send messages around what they're capable of, and they buy into that. It's reinforced every day that they're in the top group or they're in the bottom group. They
yeah,
know that, and it also cuts off opportunities because as soon as you put kids in a lower ability group, you give them lower level work.
yeah,
So even though teachers will say, oh, they can move to another group, in actual fact, they become constrained by the learning opportunities
yeah,
that they get given. The learning opportunities in the bottom level or bottom ability group are way different from what they are at the top level. So the kids don't have the
yeah,
opportunity to ever move. And if you have a variety of activities available for kids, so across the spectrum, so from easier to more difficult, where kids opt into the kinds of activities they want to do, there's much more opportunity for kids to move. There have been studies that were done in the States in the early 90s where they took kids from the bottom track and put them in the top track, and after a year, they were achieving at the same levels.
yeah, yeah,
And those kinds of studies make you even more say, why are we doing what we're
yeah,
doing? This is terrible.
yeah,
It's cruel to kids. We decide at a very young age what kids are going to be able to do for the rest of
yeah,
their life. We
yeah,
don't have the right to do that.
yeah. A couple of years ago, I interviewed Professor Robert Sternberg, and he was a principal of university once, and he abolished all SATs. And he said, if you want to get into this university, you have to write an essay, and we're going to assess your essay on creativity, on critical thinking, and that allowed for different kinds of students to enter the university. It was really, really revolutionary, a revolution, but it was really expensive because all these tests had to be corrected manually. So it didn't last in the end because it was too expensive. So, how do we create a system where mixed ability groups are going to last for 6 years or even longer? How do you maintain such a system?
In secondary school or in primary
Yeah,
school?
well, both. Well, let's do secondary school.
Well, I mean, if you've got mixed ability, the biggest hesitation from teachers is teachers like having kids that are a similar ability because it doesn't mean a lot of planning
Mm-hmm.
because all the kids are working at similar
Yeah,
levels. Whereas once you have mixed ability, then you've got all kinds of levels in your class. So there's more planning to do. But I think what teachers forget about is the reason you come into teaching for me is to make a difference for kids. And when you have kids who make huge gains because suddenly they've got opportunities they didn't have before, as a teacher, that gives you such a kick.
yeah,
That's what you went into
yeah,
teaching for, that kind of je ne sais quoi that the
yeah.
kids give you when they
That's it.
make those big gains. But yeah, I mean, I know that it takes more work at the beginning, but the gains for the kids are huge in the end.
But there's a reason for that. In especially in the United States, um, where there's I talked to Diane Ravitch, and she talked to me about the punitive system where students evaluate teachers and where teachers are um, uh, um, uh, punished if their scores are lower than the average. So you are not going to do mixed ability groups because it's a huge risk, a huge risk. Why would you do it? So how would you provide for such a system in a country like the United States or even the Netherlands?
But if you have kids who are supposedly lower ability who are making large gains, surely the system should be based around the kinds of gains that kids are making. And if you have a genuine commitment to all the kids in your class, then why would the kids be rating you lower? I don't understand that.
Yeah,
If the kids are doing well in your class, you have really good relationships with them, they have good relationships with others, all of the kinds of elements of high expectation teaching,
mm,
then I can't see why teachers would be rated lower. You get rated lower when you don't like some kids and you treat some kids badly. That's when you get rated lower. I
so
mean, we've never had a system of rating teachers in schools. We get rated at university, but we have never had a system like that in school. So it's difficult to know, what the implications are or what it would actually be like. But my feeling is, I mean, I went from being placed in high socioeconomic areas because I did well at teachers college and university. My kind of reward was
yeah,
that I got put in high
yeah,
socioeconomic
yeah,
areas,
yeah,
and as soon as I could, I got out and went into low socioeconomic because that's where I could really
yeah,
make a difference.
yeah,
And I mean, I probably pushed my kids quite hard, but I'm sure they could appreciate that they'd made big gains over a year.
yeah.
They understood that I cared about them. They understood that, the kind of environment that you were trying to foster.
Yeah, yeah. Well, John Haddy told me about a project that was going on in South Australia where teachers that go into high risk schools are paid more. Expert teachers. They have four levels. When you go as an expert into a low achieving school, you are getting paid more. That's a great initiative. It
Yeah,
seems,
I got paid more when I first went into a low socioeconomic school
yeah,
as well.
yeah, great initiative. So
I
let's.
got paid travel money as well.
Oh, great. Nice. Well, let's go to the practical side of your book. Let's assume I'm a teacher, but I don't have the means to go to one of your conferences because the, I told you that it's really expensive for teachers to go to conferences, and we are not given any time because we can't drop any class. So we have to do it in our weekends, and we don't have money for those conferences. So where do I start as a teacher? I know that I want to become a high expectation teacher. What's the first step if I wanted to do it by myself?
And you're using my book.
Yeah, but well, this is a great initiative. Yeah, you told me the book is about to be translated into Dutch, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
That's a nice first step.
There's two publishers apparently that are interested in having it translated into Dutch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's about time.
But yeah, but I mean, well, I mean, for me, high expectation teaching centers around those three key principles of using mixed ability grouping, flexible kinds of groupings, and that's coupled with high level learning opportunities, of course, and then the class climate, and then the goal setting
Yeah,
thing. And the book has specific chapters that talk about what high expectation teachers actually do, but then also specific chapters that are just for teachers
hmm,
around these are the
yeah,
kinds of things that you can do to
yeah.
create a high expectation classroom.
So that's your book. Are there any other resources online where people can go to learn about these principles?
Um, well, not really that I know of. There's the odd video of me I know floating around that people
Yeah,
have
yeah,
managed to find, but it is my work. So, um, most of the things around it are going to stem from my work, and I think that book lays it out quite well. When I had funding to do the teacher expectation project. Um, there was kind of a two pronged incentive, if you like. So when I finished the project, I wanted to write a book for teachers. I wanted a book where they could pick it up and go, oh, so that's what you need to
Yeah.
do. We'd
Yeah.
shown that these principles work, that you could train any teachers to use them. So this is what I can do. But also at the time, I was an associate professor. And in order to get to professor level in New Zealand, there's kind of an unwritten, it's definitely unwritten, but the idea that you need to produce a sole authored book. So, but that book has to be academic. So the reason that this book has kind of a lot of the background research is for that reason, because it fulfilled those two purposes
Yeah.
for me. But my primary aim was that it was something for teachers. What I didn't anticipate was that when teachers read the book, they would then want to contact me. So I've done presentations all over the world and loads in New Zealand as well. I actually counted up the other day, I've done 81 presentations in New Zealand
Wow.
over the last 5 years to schools and education organisations. That's not counting any of the ones I've done for conferences and that sort of thing. So I didn't anticipate the idea that once they had the book, that they would then want the person as well. But I still think the book is a good starting point.
Do you have a website yourself?
I'm going to.
Yeah.
That's something that I am in the process of setting up. And one of the reasons for that is because of COVID, because it's made it really more difficult, obviously. I can't travel, and I've still got people asking me about my work. So yes, that's kind of one of the next things on my agenda, if I can ever get time, is to set up a website that has modules as well that teachers would be able to dip in and out of if they wanted to.
Because I think this is a really, it's about time we get to know your work here in the Netherlands more than we do now. Because since George Floyd was murdered by cops in the United States, this huge movement spread around the world, and people started to think about their own biases since that incident, and
Mm.
governments started to think about their biases within the police force, within the educational force, and our prime minister made the statement that we have a serious problem of, we call it institutionalized racism, where even the government has biases towards certain ethnic minorities or poor socio-economic groups. So it's more timely than ever that we start to learn about the expectations we have from our students. So it's about time you design a website and spread the word. So at least, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spread the word, and there's an extensive body of literature in the back, the references, and there are a couple of writers who I really admire. The first one is Carol Dweck, and I'm going to interview her later this year, and her work is also about expectations, and there are many uh, theories about expectations, uh, Bandura's self-efficacy, and I can't come up with all the names right now, but are there any theories that really inspired you during your research?
Um, I think all of those, the kinds of theories you're talking about, like Bandura's and Carol Dweck's, and there's self-determination theory, all
Yeah,
of these kind of
yeah,
theories, they're all motivation theories.
yeah,
So they really focus on the kid. Um, they focus on how can we get kids motivated? What do we need to do to get kids motivated? And again, my work is around what can we do with teachers
yeah.
so that kids get motivated. So there are links between the theories because of that. So a lot of those are kind of macro theories of human motivation, if you like, whereas mine is much more around um, the teacher and their role in increasing student motivation.
Isn't it so much?
So mine's also very practical. It's about,
Yeah.
and that's because I was a teacher. It's about, so we've got these theories. What does that look like in practice for
It's not.
teachers?
It's not so much about motivation. It's much more, I think, about what results in certain biases and what can you do with expectations in order to um, generate higher achievements. It's not so much a
Yeah, but
It's not so much a motivational theory. I think your work.
those are also about student outcomes. So the student outcome is that uh, they will have an incremental idea about intelligence rather than a fixed, or it's about the students having autonomy and competence and so on. So it's about the student having high self-efficacy. That's what I'm getting at. But these are outcomes that are a result of the way that teachers practice. So I would completely agree that an outcome of having a high expectation teacher is that you have highly
Yeah.
motivated students who have very strong self beliefs about what they can achieve.
Yeah.
So I think, they do dovetail nicely together, but it is very much about the teacher influence on the student outcomes.
One of my last question is, well, it's got to do with your literature list, I think, as well. Is who inspires you? Another person I really admire, by the way, is Jeannie Oakes.
Oh
Keep in
yeah, I
track.
like her work
A
too.
really seminal book, I think, as well.
Yeah.
She didn't have time to do a talk, but I will get to her, I'm sure. So, if we go through your references, who's the next person for me to interview?
I mean, my inspiration the whole way along, I guess, was Rona Weinstein, but she's retired. Whether she'd talk to you, I'm not sure. But she certainly was my kind of. She talks about high and low differentiating teachers. So she's one of the few other expectation researchers who recognises the importance of the teacher in the expectation kind of framework rather than the focus on the students. But yeah, her work is fantastic. I really like her work. And her and Frank Worrell actually set up a school based around high expectation principles, which is still operating in it's not in Oakland now, it moved, but it was originally set up in Oakland. I think it's in San Jose. It's still near the Berkeley kind of area. But they had funding from Bill Gates and they set up one of those charter schools, but it's one that actually works, and the whole school
A charter
that
school that actually works.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the whole school is actually set up around high expectation theory. And they've had really good results from that. But yeah, Rona would be my inspiration. I know you asked a question as well around why do I have so many older references
Yeah.
in my
Yeah.
book?
Yeah.
And there are two reasons for that. One, for me, it's always important to acknowledge who went before. So it's important to acknowledge whose work was there that I could build on, that was already there.
Hmm.
But also, one of the reasons too is that in the 70s and 80s, there was loads of research around teacher expectations, and then it kind of died.
Yeah.
And it's really only in this century, in the 2000s, that it's kind of, I think people have realised again the importance of
Yeah.
expectations and the difference they can make for kids.
Yeah.
So it's both of those reasons. I think that's a Maori New Zealand cultural kind of thing, acknowledging your forebears, acknowledging
Yeah.
where you came from as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
both. But yeah, Rona would be my number one. And then I guess there are other expectation researchers like Tom Good, and Jerry Brophy, of course, passed away, but Tom Good is still quite active in terms of writing. He's a good one to contact as well.
Great. Well,
But
we have.
yeah, I think you should interview some of the Dutch researchers in the field
Well, I
too.
did
I mean, Annika,
Eddie Dennis.
Eddie, and Annika. Annika is really shaping teacher expectation research internationally as well.
That's an
So
interesting
I
one.
think,
Yeah. I will approach
She
her. Yeah. My last question is a personal one. I always ask my interviewees to define themselves in books, music, and food. I'm a musician by trade, so that's why I'm asking those questions because music is my life. It's really personal for me. John Hattie told me he was a music teacher once, so uh, we had a
okay.
great connection. And he said, when I retire, I will play the clarinet once more. What about music, books, and food? Let's say three musical pieces or songs, your three books that inspire you, and if you like, maybe food.
So I guess mine's more artists. I guess I'm more into ballad kind of music. I like a wide range of music, but Whitney Houston, I used to love her music, and I love Greatest Love of All because
Yeah,
that's about
beautiful,
children.
beautiful. Yeah,
That's that's probably my favorite all-time
yeah,
song.
yeah,
And then Celine Dion, Because You Loved Me.
yeah.
I love that song as well. And Elton John is my third, Candle in the Wind,
Oh,
but
beautiful. Great
lots of
taste.
his I like.
Yeah,
So those are my, yeah,
it's too bad.
books.
It's too bad Whitney Houston left us way too early because
Oh yeah. I
amazing,
think
amazing.
she was fantastic. And we were really lucky that last year Elton John came to New Zealand and he did one concert, and then he actually was sick during the concert that we were at. But then he couldn't do the rest of his New Zealand concerts, and then we
Yeah,
went into lockdown.
yeah,
So we were really lucky that we got to see him last year as
yeah.
well.
Great. Then
And
books.
Celine Dion we saw
Yeah.
the year before. We also saw Celine Dion in Las Vegas too.
She had one show in a hotel for the whole year. Yeah,
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 great. Lucky
yeah.
you,
She was
lucky you.
awesome.
She's still on my wish list. So when we move to literature or what or books,
Books. I thought this was interesting because if I had to say authors, I'd probably say Marion Keyes and Jodi Picoult. And yet, when I went and looked at my bookshelf and thought, right, what are my three favourite books? None of them were by them. So I think I really liked The Rosie Project, which is by Graham Simpson. It's about a guy who's got Asperger's, and
hmm
he loves this girl, and it's about the way that he negotiates his Asperger's and trying to get this girl to go out with him. And then there's a follow-up one as well where they actually get married. But yeah, that it's funny, but I really like that book.
all right,
And there's Jojo Moyes, Me Before You. That was recently made into a movie. It's really sad. It's about a girl who she has to go and look after a guy who has been really, he's only young and he's been really sporty and active and done all these things, and he ends up paraplegic. And so this young woman, looks after him, and they fall in love. But his parents have got her to look after him for a month. I think it's a month. And at the end of it, the deal is that he can then go to a Swiss clinic to be basically murdered. So he's allowed to choose to die. And they hope that this girl will make him, not want to do that. But he does. He does go to this clinic and end his life.
hmm
So that's sad. And then the third one is one I only read last year. It's by Abi Dare, and it's called The Girl with the Louding Voice. And
yeah.
it's about a girl in, um, now the name of the country's gone. I think it's Uganda.
Mm,
But I was fascinated by the kind of the cultural things in the story, and just the whole journey of this girl who takes herself from nothing to going to be a teacher, and kind of her journey in between. So it was an awesome book as well.
And if somebody invites you to dinner, what makes you really happy?
Um, I'm vegetarian, so it makes me really happy if they've actually thought about that. But
Yeah.
I don't really have a favorite dish. When I'm cooking, I always use recipe books, and I mostly only ever do a recipe once. It's only very occasionally that I'll go back and do
Oh,
something
all
a
right.
second time. So I like a huge variety of
But
food.
maybe not a
But
special
if
a dish, a cuisine, maybe Asian or uh,
Yeah, well then
French.
probably I like Thai food
Ah, nice.
best.
Yeah.
I like Italian food. I love Italian food, but Italian food's not good for me. I'd end up huge because I love it.
Yeah.
And Turkish food, I really like
Yeah.
Turkish food as well. It's really good for vegetarian.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, those were really personal questions. I'm really happy you were willing to answer those. And most of the time, you see people reminisce about the past. And Robert Rosenthal thought of a song with his late wife and was really emotional. So sometimes it's a really personal question. But I'm glad you were willing to talk about it. So um, I'd like to end with by thanking you a lot for spending some time with me. I'm going to share your story with my readers, and I'm going to point to the importance and the timeliness of this book. And I'm sure we will be in contact in the future, especially when you visit the Netherlands again. But for now, thanks a lot, and have a great day and enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye bye.
Okay, bye.